I had an amazing conversation with Dr. Claudelle Glasgow. We discussed the importance of connecting with ancestors, dream work, and the heart's capacity to break open again and again. Dr. Claudelle Glasgow is a student, teacher, and minister in the Vajrayana Buddhist lineage. Dr. G began their Dharma path at 19 through Yoga Sutra study and has practiced in the Soto Zen and Tibetan Buddhist traditions for 15 years. They have offered meditation instruction since 2010, and they were formally authorized to teach the Dharma in the Shambhala tradition in 2015. As their worldly service, Dr. G is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Seattle, Washington at Niles Edge. Their healing centers BIPOC and LGBT communities, working through trauma and grief resolution, engaging somatics and ritual. This human is also a practitioner of many contemplative forms, including writing, meditation, yoga, Jo, and the way of the bow. I hope you enjoy the interview.
Now it's recording. Thank you so much for joining me today, Claudelle.
Hey, of course, it's an honor.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here, and thank you for saying yes to participating in this online summit on grief and liberation. We met actually after I moved away from Portland. While you know, which is so funny.
It's like we traded spots.
We did. I lived there for a year, and then I came back to teach a yoga workshop, a skill and action workshop in April of 2019, and that's when we actually met in person. And I'm so glad that our paths crossed, and then I got to meet you.
Ditto.
Yeah. So I will. I'm going to invite us to start with a moment of centering before we dive into the conversation. So you can find a comfortable way to be in your body, if that's possible right now. And if you want to close your eyes, you can, or you can just soften your gaze. And just take a moment to turn your attention to your breath. Begin to feel your inhales and exhales. And now begin to deepen and lengthen your breath in your body. And take a moment to notice how you feel physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And now bring your awareness back to the breath. And just take a moment to let your body breathe. Now bring your awareness to your heart space and your heartbeat, and take a moment to notice what you're holding in your heart, or what is present in your heart space right now. And take a few more deep breaths here, breathing in and breathing out. And as you feel ready, you can blink open your eyes, coming back to the space. And I would love for you to share some about who you are and the work you do in the world, or your practice that you offer to the world.
Mhm. Thanks. Always evolving. I feel like every year, every move is an opportunity to listen to the landscape. So, um, having moved to Seattle a few months ago, that has changed. Um, so, everyone seems to call me Dr. G. So that is how I'm addressed and known in the community. I'm a psychologist. I'm a Buddhist chaplain. I'm really a renegade artist who's committed to healing. So the other titles are somewhat obsolete. Um, the work I do is predominantly clinical work. So I use the Western psychological model as an opportunity to help individuals with becoming in contact with their true nature, and then having an embodied, powerful self. So I do a lot of somatic practices. Um, Ironically, I do a lot of grief work and never called it such. Um, but we're awakening to the truth of who we are and reclaiming the beings that we've left behind. So a lot of my work centers that. Um, I'm a part of an amazing collective here in Seattle called Nile's Edge. It's a Black healers community, and we have sound healers and clinical psychologists um, and body workers who are helping the community in Central District. So it's really amazing to have landed in that kind of space and offer, um, gifts and healing to the community as they are asking for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A lot of powerful work. And as you know, the themes for this retreat, or the theme for the online summit, is grief and liberation. And so I'm wondering if you could share some about why it's important to be talking about grief and liberation now, given the culture and what's going on. Why now?
Mm-hmm. I feel like it's the elephant in the room. Um, we've been talking around it. It's been like a societal peeling back of what's acceptable to feel and to give space to. And I feel like naming grief really connects us to our root and our root losses, but also our root strengths. And so we've kind of, at least I see this in the psychological world when I work with people, people trickle down from, oh yeah, I get that stuff has happened. I get nowadays, especially our Black bodies are dying at an astronomical rate, and we're seeing it in such real time than we've ever seen it before. And so that's, I feel like cranially saying, oh, this is real, like this is happening a lot. Um, and then people have feels, and that
Mm-hmm.
just dissipates and ends, or seemingly does. But we haven't had a break, and because we haven't had a break, it's, I think, created more discomfort for people, and I view that as being good. Because it really allows us to experience the nuance of all the feelings that we have in response to, an increased rate of Black bodies dying, immigrant bodies being discarded and removed and sent back home. I mean, there's there's a stripping that's happening in this country right now of its its multicultural essence and its ground, um, and and that brings a tremendous amount of sadness. I feel like a lot of people are like, what is the, can only speak about the American continent, but like, what is America right now? What,
Mm-hmm.
like, is this a space where I'm safe? And when we start to get down to that level of inquiry, we're moving into the gut, and we're moving into instinct, and we're moving into something that we can all experience. Um, and it just needs to be spoken. Um, and it requires time. So I think that this
Mhm.
is like the conversation that's going to break open the paradigm of how we do things. We just it's more than just a 3 day, oh, you lost somebody kind of deal. This is, I mean, I lost my mother last year. This is still shifting and
Mhm.
changing. So um, I think acknowledging that um, these are losses connected to losses, that we have not really acknowledged the layered impact that it's had on both our psyches, but also in how we built this nation.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm wondering, you mentioned the work you do and what you're noticing with clients. How is this showing up, like the gravity of what is going on culturally and in the collective? How do you see that showing up for your clients individually, right? Because I
Mhm.
was a therapist for a long time and most people came to me for individual concerns, although they had identities, right? And culture was making
Mhm.
meaning of who they were. So we would talk about
Mhm.
that. And I haven't been a therapist, like I haven't been practicing for a couple of years. And I wonder if my clients would show up in a different way given what's going on in the cultural context right now. Have you noticed a
Mhm.
shift in your work or how people are presenting and showing up?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's that. There's the personal suffering, and then I call it the extra.
Mm,
It's the extra buzz that we um, most of my clients are, Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color. And so I acknowledge that for them. I'm like, yeah, we all have this extra that we're holding, but we're not naming that we're expected to carry. And we're always mourning. And so there can be an increase of agitation. It could be I just walked through my day and I saw this, or I just picked up a newspaper and I'm like, that is actually touching our fundamental existence as well. Each time these things happen, each time a loss occurs, it's not just that person. It's not just that person and their family. It's also a reminder of our grief as well. And so that's what I'm seeing, a little extra vibration and a little extra sensitivity to,
mhm,
yeah, I'm anxious, but there's something else. Oh, and it's so embedded in everything that we're engaging in. It's in movies, it's in TV shows, it's on Instagram. So I feel like there's no escape. People are moving through their everyday life, true, but in all of these social facets, there's some way with which they're reminded of their past and or their present, um, and that shakes the ground a little bit. Hmm.
mhm, mhm.
Hmm. So I'm finding a lot of people having difficulty finding ground, and the ground of safety has become a lot more nuanced, especially in order for me to do a lot of the body-based work, like how can we rest? Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, because it seems like in what you're saying that people are more aware of how unsafe the world is, right, moment to moment. And because
Hmm.
we can go on social media and see it, there's more
Hmm.
access for us to actually see what is happening around us and to us, right, and the ways in
Hmm.
which we're having different experiences based on our identities. So I can imagine that the somatic work is it likely probably takes more time for people to actually lean into that because they may experience safety in your office and then they
Hmm.
walk out of, or move out of that space into the world, which is different than the container that you've built in that space with them.
100%. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
So what do you feel like the relationship is between grief and liberation? Like how are they connected?
Hmm. For me, liberation is an open hand. You know, there's a sense that there isn't a grasping to whatever that might be. And for me, grief has a sensation of this, of holding. And so when I think about liberation, I think about a freedom from hold, an open hand, a space where there is receptivity, and um, and when we can name, when we can make visible, where we can bring to the surface and bring to light. There is anything hanging out in the shadows. And it seems, and I like I tell people, when we know something, when we can name something, then we are free from its power. Um, so there's something about like creating visibility, and then there's the magic, right? The minute that that's a release, the minute that that's open, then there's a possibility for, and I don't know, like that's part of the beauty of it. But there's freedom too, right? And so I see like liberation as the freedom to touch this, um, see this, work with this, be in choice around this. Um, and grief's hold is really keeping a lot of things, um, if you will, protected
Mm-hmm.
and guarded. I mean, it's wisdom in and of itself, and that's being able to touch it. And that wisdom can create freedom in ways that we probably have not imagined, um, because we don't have access to and collective access to that information. Mhm.
Mm-hmm. And is there an experience you've had with grief that has led you to that place of liberation, or is there wisdom from grief that's led you to that place of liberation or more ease or freedom, whatever words resonate for you?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, as I'd mentioned, my mom passed last February, and she had early onset Alzheimer's. So in many ways, I'd been grieving for a number of years. It's a progressive illness. You know that she's going to pass. Um, so I had had a very, in some ways, intellectual approach to, when it would happen. I would be prepared. Um, and everyone said, there's no amount of preparation that you can have for that. Including even giving her, a funeral. Like we did a funeral ceremony and blessing and cleansing, and I was like, it's going to be soon, um, and you just don't know. So when it actually occurred, on some level, um, it was like rug pulled, um, and and I was resistant initially to grieving because I'm like, I've been grieving for 6 years. There's no more room to. I need to move on, and I think that that's how I was raised to work with grief, is that it's a part of life and you move on. But I wasn't acknowledging fully like the nuances of the emotional and psychological and spiritual, um, things that were arising out of that. Like I had no reference point. Um, she was my way in into this existence. Um, and I think that it took a couple of months for me to land back into my body because I had all sorts of stuff going on. But when I did, because I was afraid of how long it would take, and I was finally able to name that. My partner had given me a grief journal, and I started writing. And writing has been my one of my grounding practices for as long as I can remember. And when I was really asking myself some questions and really naming what was coming up and how something was coming up every moment, I was in my body, I was out my body. And, I was angry. I was like way in the past, seemingly like I was all over the place. Um, and that was very vulnerable to feel that at the whim of that experience. And that it was taking space that I was like, I gotta get back to work, I had my agenda, um, and it was getting in the way. And there was so much suffering for myself around that, around just not letting it be when it arose. Um, and it wasn't all the time, but I found myself in some ways like tormented by it. And almost it became something I was fighting against and expending a lot of energy around.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I remember I couldn't practice at that time even, which has been unheard of. I couldn't imagine that was the root of, every me getting through everything. And even that, escaped me for that early time period. Um, but the freedom came from just writing it, from naming it, from being with it. Sometimes I had to adjust my work schedule. I'm like, nope, today's not that day. um,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't go in. I mean, I'm fortunate that I could work for myself and make that adjustment, but it was months and months and months of listening, naming, noticing, and letting it be. Um, and it wasn't as catastrophic as I thought that it was. And what it started to unravel without me actually thinking about it was ancestral patterns that needed healing. Um, I don't know how else to describe it, but that other than, you know, people came to me and they're like, "Hey, we need help," because something opened when she passed, and I really had failed to um, emotionally connect. Intellectually, I'm like, yeah, 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 you know, the channels are open, everyone's talking, but I didn't allow the messages to actually come through. And so the messages started coming through, and they were urgent. It was like I would wake up, and I'm like, oh, recovery. Why don't we talk about recovery? You know, where is that coming from? Or oh, um, body. Like, what's the parallel in this and in all my family's illnesses around body, and where are we vulnerable? Interesting. Like, go seek healing around that, and then listening to it. Um, and that's the piece that was scary because I felt like on some level it was beyond my ego mind, you know, of how I constructed myself and how I thought, you know, it could go. It was beyond that. I was working for generations, you know. And it was overwhelming at first until I created some senses of protection and like, you know, I call it office hours.
Mm-hmm.
Like ancestors, y'all can talk to me between 6 and 8 and like we're good. um, but that has transformed my work. And it has left me a lot less fearful about being out of control because that is the space that you really, I think for me, my mind was like, oh, we can't control this. Um, and there can be actually some relaxation around that. And that there's still a knowing that arises without us conjuring. Like it's really quite relaxing. Um, wow, relaxing. Like in the space of grief, like that had to be felt. And so that was what happened, you know, in my body too, was that I was like, oh, this feels like a rooting in relaxation that I had not experienced before. Maybe glimpses in meditative practice, but like not like this.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And what do you feel like allowed you to, I'm not sure you had an option, but what allowed you to be open to the ancestral healing you named, like the
Mhm.
ancestors coming to you and the urgency they presented with, like what allowed you to say yes to the process of like, okay, I'm going to do this healing work for
Mhm.
ancestors and people who will come after me, like what allowed
Mhm.
that to happen?
A couple of things. I think my meditation practice really helped. We're often relating to spirits in general and other deities and other spaces. So this idea of communication with existence or in a different plane of existence has been with me for a very long time, and I know that it's possible, and I believe in it, and I know so it's not far off from my mind to think that that is another way of doing the work or supporting the work that we're doing in this relative waking reality. So that, and then early on, my mom was a very she was my big supporter. It's my aunt as well, the two people in the world who were aware that I had connections with the other side, the ancestral realm, because I would often have very lucid dreaming. Um, I'd always have appearances from beings that had passed before, and I would know things that they were like, "You, there's no way that you can know that."
Mm-hmm.
And so, because of that early nurturing and just speaking about it as if it was normal, I was like, oh, this, when all else fails in my relative world, I know that this is the other space that is accessible for communication. Um, so, so that was it. And it's true. And at some point I didn't have a choice, because of um, um, how intense and how frequent the messages were coming. It's like, it's easy to ignore when it's just a couple here and there, but
Mm-hmm.
when they're coming often, um, is something to turn your head to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and I had already been feeling that itch anyway. That it doesn't take much to look. Well, I guess I shouldn't take it for granted. I'm just looking at the state of where we are as people and as a nation and what's happening and the agitation that's happening within people, the busyness, the speed. It's the momentum is creating a sense of urgency in and of itself. Deaths are more current; they're overlapping. I can't keep track.
Mhm.
We're on all the time. Um, just that cadence of time in this place also creates a sense of I got to keep up, and also now, like now's the time. Waiting moves thought and moves things way too quickly, just
Mhm.
because of what we have available to us, good and bad.
Mhm. Mhm.
Hmm. Hmm.
You mentioned wisdom when you were talking about um, grief, and I'm wondering what lessons grief has taught you, because I know it's ongoing. Continually experience loss because we're alive,
Hmm.
and we're dying as we're alive. So, what lessons has grief and the process of allowing yourself to grieve taught you?
Hmm. Surrender. Um, Surrender is a complicated word. For me, initially it meant giving up, um, but it embodied in the practices I've been doing. It's been a deep relaxation um, so that something can arise. The trusting that something does arise that comes from a space that is beyond me. Um, that's been what's most powerful. So when I can relax my body and like do a lot of yin and restorative practices, um, something something arises, and that feels like um, you know a birthing from myself and my ancestors. It's not just of my cognitive mind, but it's also relaxing into like my innate strengths, and trusting in myself. And so there's a lot less struggle and suffering when I can accept that this is a part of my human experience um, to feel this, to be in this space, to have this wash over, to
Mhm.
fundamentally, I don't have control. And so surrender is about that too, and that can actually be um, liberating, and freeing to know that I actually don't have all the control, you know, and that's all right.
Mhm. Mhm.
So for me, yeah, that and that there can be safety and surrender is just I'm still learning that and feeling that, and I'm like, okay, this is pretty profound.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. I think grief, I don't want to say it forces us to, but maybe it invites us into that practice you just named of surrender. But it's like grief is something, in my experience, I have to reckon with, right? It's like it's not going to go away even when I don't process it. It's still going to be there, and it's affecting
Hmm.
me in some way. So that's what I
Hmm.
mean when I say I have to reckon with it. And this idea of surrender or softening into or relaxing into the experience of it, because we don't have control, feels really powerful in the way you described it. And I'm
Hmm.
not sure there are other emotional experiences like that work in that way other than grief. I'm not sure, because I feel like grief has been the biggest teacher of like, all right, you have no control, right? So, right, it's like you can't, you're not going to be able to stop this from happening, right? So here we are.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
like that, which makes it feels like it's unique for me, you know, in its experience. When I think about other emotional experiences, grief feels very unique in that way.
Well, I think too because of American society and pace. And so I think when I'm speaking to my friends in other cultures or even speaking to family back home in Trinidad, they're like, well, it took a couple weeks, I took a month, I just did something. This sense, I think what creates the reckoning and the difficulty for me is about the pace, and that I know that I'm working against constructs that don't allow the time for. And even further pathologize, right? Like I'm in the field of pathology. Like it's like it's a week and we were falling into something else that's a fact, an illness. It's like, no, it's actually, it's not.
Mhm.
And so that's where I run up with the most conflict. It's like, you need a year, you need to, that's a root disturbance, go forth and let that settle in your nervous system before coming back. And how many of us have that luxury, you know?
Right, right.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
the culture doesn't really allow us to have
Hmm.
space
Hmm.
and time that we need to
Yeah,
heal. Mhm.
yeah, yeah.
You mentioned some practices, meditation and yin and restorative yoga. Are there rituals and practices in addition to the ones you named that help you um, grieve or move through a process of grief?
Hmm. Well, I also mentioned writing. I was keeping a
Yes.
grief journal for the first like 6 months or so, and that's been absolutely fascinating. Um, so I've been doing that, and I've been spending a lot more time in nature. I'm very much a believer of reincarnation, but also of spirit animals, that our ancestors come back. And so I waited, um, and attended and spent a lot of time in nature, and actually did need to, because they came to me out of nature, which was really sweet. Um, and it is still like my totem animal. So relating to that and learning about um, animal spirit, um, and attending to dreams. I've
Mhm.
also done a lot of dream work. And the messages from those who are passing in transition often come during that time. Um, Ironically, cross traditions, it's about the first 49 days. Like, who knows? It's the same in Buddhism, it's the same in other cultures, ironically. But usually during that period, I receive messages. And so I keep a dream journal. And that informs a lot of things, even though I may not get it,
Mhm.
but it's an important ritual.
Mhm.
Um, hmm, we have an ancestor shrine in our home. So this is just a space where we make offerings and just have their presence with us. We have their presence at Thanksgiving, just like on the table. Um, and that holding space, or just welcoming, is an important ritual to me as well, of the remembering. Um, mhm, mhm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Instead of shutting them out, which is what I think can happen due to the pace and just dominant culture and how it's structured, like welcoming the energies in, right, because they're present,
Mhm, mhm,
versus resisting them and acting like we're just over the loss, right, and if we don't look at their picture, we don't make an offering, right, then they're not
mhm,
there, or that loss isn't there, the impact of it, which is false. So I really
mhm,
appreciate the idea of like, they're at the table at Thanksgiving, they're here because they
mhm.
are there, right?
Right. Yeah.
And you have a relationship with them even as they've transitioned from their physical bodies.
Mhm. And we need that there are lessons, and sometimes, I mean, how often have we recognized things in retrospect? And so that's why I feel like this is really a part of our collective healing moving forward, is that there's a lot of things that, our ancestors before us just didn't have time, space, or couldn't even name, that would have been helpful for their healing and their freedom. And perhaps if we listen, right? I don't know.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Hmm.
So what do you what could it look like culturally for us to prioritize spaces to grieve or work with ancestors in the way that we've been talking about, in order to find some liberation and freeze? What needs to happen? Like, what could it look like to prioritize that space that we're talking about, and the practices that you named, the writing and the meditation and yoga and work with ancestors? What could this look like on a collective scale?
Hmm. Um, well, first, it's like normalizing conversation, and social media is a really powerful tool for that. So I just feel like people, frankly, speaking about when loss has occurred is wonderful, um, because it just names it, and naming it afterwards, sometime afterwards, that this is still a thing, that this is still impacting me, I'm still unraveling it from it, is important too, to just give a more realistic picture of that this is not an episodic, one and done kind of thing. Um, Also, I don't know what the luxury is in spaces of employment, but that we definitely need to increase the amount of time that we have to grieve. and not discriminate around the importance of who the person is that we are grieving. You know, oftentimes that we'll only given time if they're our immediate family and as defined by whom. And so that's really important to, if we have the luxury to say, you can take a maximum of X amount of time, but how much time do you need? Or what do you need? I think it can go a long way for employers and other peoples to ask that question of around how much space do you actually need and how can you support the person so that maybe they can't leave their job full time, but they can get some help, extra help with childcare. They can get some extra help. And I'm talking like 6 years out. So I always tell people like plan for a year. It takes a year for your nervous system to regenerate. It takes a year plus for your nervous system to also adjust to a trauma. Grief is a trauma. It's almost like having a stroke. You know, it's just there's a stopping and there's a looking around of what the hell happened and a reorienting. So I don't mince that. So more conversations, and I think that that's already happening, and memorials and celebrations of life. And so there's important parts of a person's life that ring true, and so that we have celebration around that. Been doing a lot more personal work around exploring my indigenous cultures and like what they did and how it's not spoken about very much. And so I'm like, why? Because there isn't space. There isn't space to, or it's viewed as being demonic or strange. So musics and dance and celebration and remembrance and storytelling. And so that's a big way that unfortunately I haven't been with my family of origin, but telling stories about, you know, those who have passed keeps their spirit alive, but also continues to help open to what stories and things you might have to learn. So even though I don't have my immediate family here, I'm always telling my wife stories about like if she does anything. I'm like, oh, my mom would say, and that just calls and brings them closer. And having a space of remembrance of these important people who have passed as well. We've done them on the streets. We can do them in our homes and not be fearful of their presence, and supplicate to them. Like not only if the repair can still be done across the boundaries of existence. And so a lot of people lose people because that's the nature of death before they're ready. We're never really ready. And there may be some stuff that needs to hashing out, you know, and so you can have a dedicated space with which you can light a candle, have something to remind you of them. It doesn't have to be a photo, it could be their favorite food or whatever. And for a short period of time, be like, you ticked me off, or what the hell happened, or how do I do this? And I found that people who are just even able to engage in that way receive answers. And that can really be important in their future healing. So that's how I imagine, you know, and that we have conferences on it. Like, I mean, I just think that it can be a part of the dinner table conversation and be like, you know, and like, how, I mean, that's why I ask, how's your heart? Because that's the truth of things, right? So we can not be afraid of that.
Yeah, I love the idea of healing happening even after someone's transition. So what you named at the end about either setting up an altar or having a space where maybe you have the picture of the person that's passed or the being, or maybe you have their favorite food, but you're like letting them know, you pissed me off here, or I don't know how to do this, I really need your help. I'm calling you in to offer some answers to me. I love that, because I think so much, I've witnessed so many things continue to be unresolved, and it caused a lot of trauma for people as they've tried to move through the grief and loss and move forward, that they haven't taken the time, because they haven't been encouraged to go back and really try to engage and continue that relationship even as the person's passed. Because culturally, I don't think dominant culture invites us into that, right? And this idea that once we're gone, we're gone. So we can't resolve whatever harm happened. And I love the idea of, I actually think it's necessary, what you named, that practice to be able to heal. And I think it connects to what you named earlier about ancestral healing. Like that actually might allow us to heal folks in our lineage and as I said, people who will come after us, so we're not replicating trauma.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's still like the memory of people still lives in our bodies.
Right.
And so, I mean, I always tell people the brain's kind of dumb in that way. Like, it doesn't know the difference between imagining a person there and the person actually being there. And so, in that way, we can create a sense of like presence, so that we can work through and work with whatever didn't get complete, or what just needs to be named. Like, so.
So you mentioned the heart, and in the meditation, I asked what you're holding in your heart, and part of the theme for the summit is grief and liberation, and part of it's just because the theme is related to us living during heartbreaking times. So I just want to ask you, like, how is your heart now? What are you holding in your heart?
I'm not holding anything. It's very much continually breaking, and that may sound like agony, but it's actually allowing itself to be impacted, and mended and impacted and mended again. There's a tenderness that comes from just, my armor is vulnerability, and so to allow that to just be the norm, and for my heart to be open, and for it to be and have capacity to be touched. That for me inspires a lot of curiosity, and inspires connection even with people I don't think that I wanted to be connected with. And so I'm just, it makes me wonder about that other person's heart. Like, well, I've allowed you to impact me, in all the ways that all the micros happen. And I'm still like, wow, that hurt me, but what's going on for you? And so that just creates a more open conversation and relationship with a lot more people than I ever thought. Yeah, and it just seems infinite in that way. So yes, a continually breaking heart is what I'm holding.
Yeah, I love what you said about it. Just means you're allowing your heart to be impacted, right? You're feeling what's going on. You're responding to what's going on instead of not allowing yourself to feel, right? Which I think dominant culture doesn't want us to feel or be talking about feelings. And so I think it's a powerful practice to allow your heart to be impacted and notice how it's being impacted, and then what it needs in response, right? And that's a continual process because we're alive at this time. That's just how it is. If we allow ourselves to feel.
Yeah, and that I'm not falling apart, like as a result of that, is actually grounding me even more, because then I'm sitting more, or I'm out in nature more, because I'm increasing more of my capacity to like hold that, because these questions are curious to me. Like, I'm like, wow, that really touched me, but like, what was also going on with this other person? Like, where are they coming from? And so my place of pondering is nature and walking, and so then I start doing that activity, or going near water, and that just, there may not be an answer, but there's more capacity to engage that again, and then I'm restored. I'm not falling apart. Yeah.
Which it seems like sometimes people feel like they're going to fall apart if they allow themselves to feel, and that they assume I'm going to fall apart, I'm going to be in pieces, and you're naming that the practice of actually having a broken heart, acknowledging it, knowing your heart's going to be impacted, actually helps ground you, right? It does the opposite, right? It's, even though your heart's breaking, you're not falling apart because you're able to touch your heartbreak and connect with it, which I think is important for people to hear and know. So I have one more question before we pause our conversation. I was going to say wrap up, but I'm sure we're going to have other conversations about grief.
I sure hope so.
I do too. We talked earlier, I asked you about the relationship between grief and liberation, and I just want to ask you what collective liberation means to you. Like, what does collective liberation mean to you, or what would it look like if it's easier to describe it in images?
I think I go back to that, to this like this broken heartedness, because Liberation for me doesn't mean I'm out for my own freedom. It also means that I'm out for your freedom as well. And there's some investment in understanding that we're linked. Um, and so in some ways, like if I can imagine like a broken heart, but with its veins intersecting and tendrilled and wrapped with other people's hearts, it's like that there's connectedness, and we give life to one another actually, in our ability to know and to face and to allow space for and to name and acknowledge. Um, and so like for me liberation looks like very honest and vulnerable conversation that can happen in a moment, and it can happen in 6 hours, and it can happen over 6 years, depending on what people have capacity for. But we can show up in that way with that openness, and also that invites them curiosity, right? So that curiosity interrupts our our tendency to repeat what we've done before and to work out of habit, right? Curiosity gives us pause. Heartbreak gives us pause, whether we want to or not. And so for me, that's the key to shifting conversations that have become so agenda focused, and I call them cranial conclusions is what I call them. It's like, can we just get to that? Like, can we like leave that? We are getting to it. The fact that we have addressed it and named it is getting to it, and it needs more space. So for me, it would be like creating less cranial work, more embodied work, more just not knowing in community with one another, um, and welcoming that with others, whether they're different or the same. Um, there's just something about the organic nature of that, and that nature of conversation and spending time and leaving things unfinished, um, that creates a tremendous amount of space for a possibility that I can't even begin to picture. But it would be a consideration of other, like, oh, I'm noticing this for myself, and then an opening, and then what else is in the room and in the space to consider. Oh, okay, that shifts things. Just even that would be like, mind blowing, mind
Yeah,
blowing.
it would be. Yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of imagine everybody with dinosaur tails. Um, in that we're just like rooted, right? Like
Yeah.
that we are rooted, so that this doesn't take as much agency.
Yeah, I love that image. Everyone with dinosaur tails. Yeah, that would be something for sure. Real. I love that. Are there things coming up in 2020? This will launch this summit in late January. Are there things coming up in 2020 that you want folks to know about, or is there a way people can contact you if you want them to be able to follow your offerings and your work?
Sure, yeah. So people can find me at www.claudelleglasgow.com. That's the best way to keep up with the events that are always unraveling. And this year for me is about collaboration. So what a wonderful way to begin with you. And so collaboration is what I'm about, and collaboration around grief specifically. And so I'm doing all sorts of things and welcoming all sorts of things that have yet to show themselves around that. I have a few writing projects that I'm contributing to on the topics of grief, and also the intersection of queer and BIPOC identity. Um, Always doing a meditation program or retreat, mostly in the Seattle and Pacific Northwest region, but happy to travel. And for me, 2020 is the age of humanity. I feel like it's a big shifting point for our collective consciousness, and we're at a throttle, and so stay tuned for some seasonal and quarterly offerings that I'll hopefully offer online around how to work with that and make conversations like this more every day.
Well, I'm excited to see what's to come, and to see more of your offerings in 2020. And I really appreciate you saying yes to this conversation, because I do want us to normalize a conversation about an experience that all of us have, right? All of us experience loss and grief continually. And I think, at least I know the people I'm talking to through this, all of us want collective liberation as well. I know space to grieve is part of that, part of the way we'll get to liberation. So thank you for saying yes, and thank you for the work you do in the world. I just know it's powerful work and necessary. And thank you for doing the work you do to help people remember themselves and to come home to themselves. Like, that's what I just heard in what you said about the work you do. You didn't use those words. That's what I heard. So I appreciate who you are, and thank you for having the conversation today.
Thanks for starting the space off.
And more collaboration, yeah, in
Yes.
2020 for sure.
Yes.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
this opportunity. Yeah.